Hi guys, welcome back. So for this second video, I'm gonna show you how to use for loops in conjunction with lists, which were a topic of a previous module. And hopefully you'll get to see some of the power of for loops once you combine them with lists. So we're gonna start with an example. You can go ahead and do this in REPL as well, just like before. I'm going to create a list called names. I'm going to put the variable name in all caps just because I'm going to treat it like a constant. And I'm going to create a list of, in my case, names of students from my class. So you can use these names or you can substitute names of your own. I've got Alicia, Brandon, Siani, Edward, Tiana, and Gregory. When you're doing this with your students, it's fun to use their names, just, to increase engagement a little bit. And then, just because I'm working with a list, I'm going to make a variable called length, and that's going to be whatever the length of names is. Okay? So that should give me the length. So the first thing I want to do is I want to show you how to print out this list by using a loop, okay? So we're gonna print out all names using a for loop. Now, this is not super exciting because we could also just print out the names, by printing out names, but this should illustrate to you how to use a for loop to iterate over all items in a list, and then we'll be able to do other things with that concept. So in this case, we are going to use the index variable, which is I, to represent the indexes in the list. So let me show you what I mean by that. If you just want to watch this, and then I'll have you pause the video so that you can try it on your own. So I'm going to set up my loop for I in range. Now the first index of my list is going to be 0, so I'm going to start at 0. And I'm going to stop at length, which, if you remember, was the variable I defined to be whatever the length of names was, okay? So that is a typical setup for how you would iterate over a list. You go from 0 to the length of the list. And what am I going to print out? Well, I want to print out an item each time from the list called names. So I'm going to type in names. But anytime I want just one item, I have to use, remember, this square bracket notation. So the question is, what number is going to go inside of the square brackets? If I put just a fixed number, like say 1, then it's going to print out Brandon, 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 right? I don't want it to always print out index 1. I want it to print out index 0, then index 1, then index 2, then index 3, etc. So for that reason, inside of the square brackets, I'm going to put I, because that's the variable that is changing each time the loop iterates. So I'm going to run that, see what pops up, and I get everybody's name printed out in a nice column. So that is cool. So let me close that. So I'm going to have you pause the video now. Go ahead, if you didn't already, create your list of names with its length, and then use this for loop to print out all of the names. Pause the video and then restart when you are ready. Great. So hopefully you got that working. What I want to do now is I want to show you another way to use a for loop to iterate over a list. And this is a particularly nice trick to use in the Python language. It doesn't work in all languages. This type of for loop, where you're using the index variable to represent the index in a list, this will work in lots of different languages that you use. But let me show you this other way as well, because it's pretty cool. So first, I'm just going to start by printing a new line, just to skip a line. And now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a variable to represent the actual item in the list rather than its index. So let me show you what that means. So I'm going to say for name in names. Whoa, so that looks way different than what we did before. And I'm just going to print name. So what's going on here, I'm saying, okay, I'm still iterating over this list names, And now I'm using this little variable name to represent each subsequent item in the list. It doesn't represent an index 0, 1, 2. It represents the actual name. So what am I going to do each time? I'm going to go ahead and print it out. So let's see. Cool. So it did print out. So go ahead, pause the video, type that into REPL using the actual variable to represent the item in the list this time. Go ahead and do that. Great. So when you're teaching for loops to students, a really common mistake is that they're going to mix up the two different types of loops. So let me show you. Like a typical error would be students typically like to use this second type of loop because it feels like it should be more intuitive. You know, for each name in names, you can kind of read that like a sentence. That makes sense. And then they'll say, okay, print name sub I. They'll do that because they're so used to that subscript notation for for lists. And then if you do that, you're going to get an error. In this case, it's an index error because we haven't even defined what I is in this particular loop, so that just doesn't make sense. So the key idea to kind of have students reiterate is that in this type of loop, the variable I represents the index, whereas in this type of loop, the variable name represents the actual name, okay? And they'll make that mistake over and over, and you kind of just have them keep pointing back to this example to help them, okay? So here's a challenge for you guys. So go ahead and change the code, and you can choose either loop so that it prints only the first 2 letters of each student's name. So for example, instead of Alicia, it should print AL, okay? So you can use either loop as your starting point. It's up to you. Go ahead, pause the video, and try to change the loop so it prints out just the first 2 letters of each student's name. When you're done, you can restart it, and I'll show you how I did it. Okay, so let's see how we can do this. I'm going to show you how to do it with both loops because the idea is the same. So in this first loop, names sub I is going to refer to each subsequent name in the list. So if I only want the first 2 letters of each element in the list, I'm going to use my string slicing, and I'm going to go from 0 to 2 so that it will print out the 0 and 1 index. So let's see if that works. And here we go. We've printed out the first 2 letters of everyone's name. So again, the idea is that instead of printing out each name sub I, we are going to take that name sub I and print out only the 0 to 2 slice of it. We can do the same exact thing down here, where name actually refers to the element of the list. Instead of printing out the whole name, we'll just print out the 0 to substring of that name. And there we go. Okay. So I want to show you one more thing in this video, which is how strings and lists can kind of interact. Sometimes it'll be useful to take a list and turn it into a string, or vice versa. We'll see that coming up in lots of our future challenges. So I want to give you an example of how to do that now. I'm going to delete this code. You don't have to delete yours. So I'm going to keep my list of names. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to concatenate all names in names into a single string. Okay? So I want to take this whole list and I want to make one string that just has the names Alicia, Brandon, Siani, Edward, Sienna, and Gregory. So the way to do this is we're going to start with a pretty standard trick, which is to create an empty string. This is something you'll do really frequently. This string is ultimately going to hold all of my students' names. So I'm going to call it all names with an underscore in between. You can call it whatever you want, but remember to emphasize to your students that you want to create variable names that are meaningful. I'm going to put a set of quotations with nothing inside. This is called an empty string. Python knows it's a string because of the quotations, but it has no content. But what I'm going to be able to do is, as I loop over this list, I'm going to add each name into this string so I can build it up into what I want it to be. So I'm going to use the second type of loop here for name and names. And what am I going to do? Well, I'm going to take my string, all names, and I'm going to update it to whatever it was before, but I'm going to add or concatenate whatever name I'm on in the list. And then after the for loop is over, I'm going to print out that string to see if it did what I wanted it to do. Okay, so I'm going to run that. Don't worry about typing it yet. And there it is, Alicia, Brandon, Siani, Edward, Tiana, Gregory. Now, maybe this looks a little funny. Maybe we want spaces in between each name. So we could easily do that by concatenating name with a space, something like that. So encourage your students to play around with the code to get the output formatted in the way that they want. So go ahead, pause the video, type in this code, make sure that it works, that you're able to concatenate all of the items of a list into a string. Great, so hopefully you got that working. So we're getting to the point now where there will start to be bugs in the code or the output won't be exactly what you want. So a good technique as you're learning, and then also for your students, especially when you're looping, is just to throw in print statements inside the loop so that you can see what Python thinks the current value of a variable is. So for instance, in this loop, if I wasn't getting the output I wanted, I might throw in a print statement and ask it to print out the current value of all names each time we iterated through the loop. So this way you can see, okay, the first iteration of the loop, it's just Alicia, then it's Alicia Brandon, then it's Alicia Brandon Siani, etc. And this can kind of help you and your students see what's happening each iteration of the loop rather than just the final output. So that can be really helpful. And I want to show you just, or I want you to try, one last thing. So why don't you concatenate, so write a loop that concatenates the first two letters of everyone's name into a string. So go ahead and pause the video and see if you can complete this challenge. When you restart the video, I'll show you how I did it. Great, so let me show you how I did this. So I'll actually just use the code I have here. So each time we go through the loop, instead of adding the entire name to all names, just like we did before, I'll add name sub 02, and that will add just the first two letters of the current name to all names. I'm not going to print it out each time for this particular run. And there we go. We've concatenated the first two letters of everyone's name into a string. So we'll refer back to this from time to time whenever we need to sort of go back and forth between strings and lists. So this is the end of the second video.